again. Now we're here for our plenary panel, Adopting Organic Management Practices Inside and Out. So, we talked a little bit. I spoke to you a little bit last night, and I've got a couple of workshops where I'm offering, little comments, and I'd like to address a little bit of this issue before we get in. Each speaker will have about a 20-minute time frame, and I'm only going to just take a very few minutes here. So, adopting organic land management practices, that's really what this is all about. The idea that, we've heard about the health effects of pesticides, we've heard about the liability issues of pesticides, we've heard a lot of the science, and now we're talking about the fact that pesticides simply are not necessary. We have gotten to this stage where we can move beyond pesticides and be able to manage landscapes with cultural practices, with allowed materials, and with the knowledge and the understanding that if we do it properly and in the right way, we can be successful. So, I want to encourage you to focus on the big picture here. Always remember that the practitioners are on the front lines. Whether it's a practitioner working on the public park where our children play, working in your backyard, or working on that building or that structure, whether it's a hospital, whether it's a university, or whether it's any other type of a facility. We need to focus on management practices that respect nature as opposed to trying to intervene with it. I think in all of my work, when I work my work is grounds work, so I'm outside of the buildings, but I've had a lot of experience with Jay working inside of buildings. And I think that the biggest limitation to the more rapid, widespread adoption of organic management practices is inherent fear of failure by the practitioner. The fact that they believe, because of their industry training, because of their extension training, because of all that they have heard, that organic will not work. And they're afraid for their jobs. They fear that whether it's inside or out, if there's an insect anywhere around, any kind of a pest, that they're going to be held responsible. So the training, the education that is happening nationally is to try to eliminate and take away that fear of failure. That happens in both the public and private sectors. I'm going to make the comment here that we can't get mired in the discussion of integrated pest management. IPM is something that's been around for a long time, and in its original concept back in the 1980s, it might have been a good decision-making protocol, but it's all been co-opted. So anytime anybody approaches us and says that, well, we don't really need you organic folks because we have IPM, you have to stand up and say, no, that's not good enough. We are beyond that. Why focus on a pest? That's what integrated pest management does. I propose that we focus on something called integrated cultural management. Focus on the culture. Focus on what you are doing culturally to try to mitigate a pest. And let that system, you've heard the word systems approach, systems management, and that's what it is. It's focusing on the culture. I'm going to introduce Patti Wood here in a minute, and I have to acknowledge that 20 years ago when I started this, Patti was and her husband Doug, largely responsible for ingraining in me a lot of these concepts and gave me the opportunity to go off and take those concepts into where it went. So Patti, to you and Doug, I owe you a huge. So made big changes, not just here in New York, but everywhere. So we're talking about system change. And that's really what it's all about. So how do we measure success? So how do we measure success in what we're doing? Well, you saw the pictures here last night that T has done on his amazing landscapes. That's success. You have a benchmark. You have a real-world measure of success. So success is when we can meet a communicated set of expectations. Whether it is that hospital that is looking for alternative pest management to get rid of pesticide pressures inside of a facility, or whether it's outside on that soccer field, when we have a facilities manager or a coach that's demanding some set of expectations. So We measure success when we meet that communicated expectation, and that expectation may be low, medium, or high. Does it need to be high everywhere and go out and grab an herbicide to blast every little piece of clover out of a municipal public park or an athletic field? Probably not. So now we have to go out and change people's thought processes. That we have an industry that told us that this was not acceptable. You can't have this plant in there. You have to have a monoculture. And now we all have to go out and spread the message that it's okay to have diversity, that we don't need that. As long as that athletic field or that public park is usable, playable, and functional, grass has two things, aesthetics and function. If it functions, that's what we have it there for. All landscapes don't need to be high expectation. Chemical companies have a lot of product to sell. Scott's Insect Control. They sell it every spring. It's going to come on TV in June. That now's the time to grab this bag of poison and put it out in your backyard and kill all the insects that are going to damage your lawn. I venture to say that everybody here in the room, there may be one or two insects that may potentially be a problem, but you're going to be told to go out and take a product to do that. And I had the opportunity to square off face-to-face with Scott's and suggest to them that their motivation for that was to take $40 out of my back pocket and put it in the front pocket of their corporation. And they did not deny that. And for the rest of the hour, they were largely silent. So what is needed? Where do we go from here? We need communication. We need to develop a systems-based protocol for both inside and outside of structures. We need to understand there's a transition period. It does not happen overnight. It's a process, and we're going to work through that process in a very intelligent manner. Implementation. How do we implement it? The cultural intensity. Cultural intensity is a term that describes what do we put into it? Labor, water if it's outside, product input if that's needed. So what level of cultural intensity do we need? We need to break the dependence upon chemicals, and then we have to create measurable benchmarks. And that's what it really takes, because if we do that in that order, we're going to be able to show success and show that we've achieved that goal of managing without these chemicals that we all in the room want to get rid of. So with that, our first speaker is going to be Gabriela Marin. She is an experienced horticulturist who holds a PhD in horticulture from the University of Agronomic Science and Veterinary Medicine of Bucharest, Romania. At the Battery, Gabriela plans and coordinates horticultural projects from concept to implementation and directs the annual horticultural internship program. With a rich background and commitment in public gardening, Gabriela has been making the gardens at the Battery more exciting to professionals and visitors for almost a decade. Gabriela.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so honored to be here today. I never thought that so many people are thinking, especially the medical field, is thinking about this, about the pesticides. I was always thinking only the horticulturists, they have this problem, but I'm glad to be here today. And what I want to share is the place where I'm working. And let me see how this is working here. And to tell you a few things, jumped ahead, about our organization, which is the Battery Conservancy, and has been founded in 1994. And is a nonprofit organization, and we partner with the Department of Parks and Recreation, and we have to redesign, build, and maintain, and we do our best for 25-acre park. Today we are thinking of ourselves. We want to think that we are a model of conservation and biodiversity with perennial gardens, with urban farms, and toxic-free lawns. Let me see, and this is how much green space we have nowadays. if I get a feel with this computer. Sorry. Then enter. I'm sorry, I have a problem. Thank you. Oh, okay. Okay, this one. I want to stay here for a little bit.
So that's how you go forward.
Okay, thank you. Technology. Okay, we have 195,000 square feet of gardens, and we are the largest perennial gardens in North America, free and open to the public every day. It's something that we need to think about in our management, and this is how we are doing it. Our designer is Pete Odolf, and has been commissioned in 2002 to develop the horticultural master plan, and his style is based on texture, structure, fragrance, and color, and I'm sure that engage visitors every season. In our gardens, we always used organic products, but we combine them with cultural and mechanical management, and we are focusing on soil health and monitoring a lot. So, as we know, pests in our landscape includes, like everywhere else, we see insects, we see mites, we see weeds, we see plant diseases, and it's very tempting to look for a quick solution and just spray everything, but this is not what we are doing, because all of them, however, they play a role in our ecosystem. What we call pests are part of a natural system at work, and as we know, an ecosystem has no pests. What we are trying to do the best is to be more successful by managing unwanted pests, that follow predictable patterns, so this is what we want to use in our advantage. Prevention, as I said, is very important, so we pay really attention to the places from where we buy the plants, and we try to buy from well-known nurseries. We plant them carefully, and also we provide everything. We make sure that we provide everything they need, so we minimize the stress for them and minimize the pest problems. We are trying to keep also records because that will help us to make informed decisions. From cultural management point of view, we are interested also in soil management, and what we are doing every year at the end of the winter, we are going outside and we chop every single plant in very small pieces, and we leave it on the ground as fertilizer and as mulch, so we don't use any other chemical products in our gardens, and this is what all the plants are getting. And this helps us to reduce soil water loss, to minimize weed competition, and creating a sustainable environment for earthworms and microorganisms. Plant selection is important too, and we are trying to buy cultivars that are tolerant to pests, and on top of that, we change our irrigation practices from overhead to drip irrigation, so to minimize some diseases. But all those cultural techniques require advanced planning, plant and pest knowledge, and more staff to be trained and hired. Those are some of our challenges. As mechanical and physical control, we still use the water sprays to knock off the aphids and spider mites, and we are still hand pulling weeds, but before setting seeds. These practices, again, require staff, and they are time consuming, but we are doing it. In regards of our lawns, we don't apply any herbicides or any pesticides, only organic fertilizer, and when it's needed, and after we are doing like soil tests. All the grass clippings, after we are mowing the lawns, they are returned to the soil, and also in the fall, all the leaves, we chopping them in very small pieces with the lawn mowers, and they will stay on the ground. We are seeding also frequently, if we have a little bit of time, and in certain areas, believe it or not, we are pulling weeds from the lawns. To prevent also compaction, we close the lawns during the winter. We don't allow dogs only in certain areas that are designed for them. And also we close the lawns when it's wet and rainy. And this is how those are like the practices that we are using them for, we are using for the lawns. And I think I mentioned all of them. In regards of our farms, we treat them in the same way like with our perennial gardens, but on top of that, we are using only organic seeds to start our vegetable crops. We rotate the crops, we interplant. We are making also compost. We grow crops with tight spacing to outcompete the weeds. We mulch with wood chips in the pathways, and we plant cover crops. One of the challenges that we have in the park, and I'm sure it's in many places in New York, are the rats. So in regards of the rats, we didn't do, we change our approach. At the beginning, I know when the organization was founded, they used like chemicals, rodenticides, and tracking powder to reduce the number of rats. And nowadays we turn to other techniques, like a company that is using food-baited snap traps to reduce, so the, like Slim Jack, I think Slim Jack, I forget the name of the product, but it's something based on food. And also we have an engine called BoroRx that produces carbon monoxide, and that goes into our soil and helps us to reduce the number of rats and the burrows. Another challenge that we faced was the Superstorm Sandy, which affected our soil fertility by elevating the soluble salts at that time. So what we did in that late fall, we tried to go outside and we tried to flush the soil with fresh water about 2 or 3 inches for a few hours. But even with this kind of effort, the next spring, we found out that probably half of the plants from certain parts of the garden died. And during the next years, we lost about 17 London plane trees and some native hydrangeas. What we are trying to do nowadays is to monitor and manage the pest levels, to preserve the environment, to protect the health of human and animals, and maintain the beneficial organisms and other pollinators. We are looking forward to our future, and that means a new playscape that is gonna be, obviously is designed for kids and for everybody. But the special thing is, besides the the granite slides and playhouses and sand and water, there will be more gardens to take care and to enjoy every single day. So this is how we are managed, and I'm grateful that I had this chance to share it with you, and feel free to come downtown and check our park. Thank you so much.
Our next speaker is Patti Wood. She is the founder and executive director of Grassroots Environmental Education, a not-for-profit environmental health organization. A visiting scholar at Adelphi University, Patti lectures on the environment and related health issues in the College of Nursing and Public Health. She is the co-producer of the documentary film, Our Children at Risk, which explores the latest scientific research linking environmental toxins to children's health problems. Patti.
I'm just going here, right? Okay. I do. Good thing.
It's not there. Good thing I had the flash drive in my pocket. Well, while he's bringing up my PowerPoint, I would just like to mention that Ben Callow should probably visit this park, the Oval Park down at Battery, where his child can actually touch the grass. Yeah. And eat it, as they often do. Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm going to go quickly because I have a lot of things to cover. I have a little bit about Grassroots and who we are. We are an environmental health organization. We inform the public about the health risks of common environmental exposures and their linked to human health problems. And we try to empower individuals to act as catalysts for change in their own communities. And we strive to accomplish this using science-driven arguments for clean air, clean water, safer food supply, and for stricter regulation of chemicals and radiation. We believe that positive and lasting change is best accomplished through grassroots initiatives, and that's what this is really all about. So this is a park in our community, Port Washington, which had been sprayed with pesticides for at least 2 or 3 decades, and we were able to go to our town and say that this was completely unacceptable, because this is a place where children spend a lot of time, and we were able to do that, and that was about 15 years ago. So also back in the 1990s, that dates myself, I know, but this is my street, and these are all of my neighbors. And we live in a typical suburban community. Our houses are in close proximity to each other, and so when anybody was spraying, we were all getting the downside of that. Through drift and runoff into other people's properties. So we had a lot of kids on our street, and even those whose kids had grown and gone away were 100% for making this street pesticide-free. So this was actually on the front page of the Port Washington newspaper, and we got a lot of interest from other communities and other neighborhoods as well. I was a very involved parent in my kids' elementary school, And I was the head of the nutrition committee, and as part of that, it was a natural extension to start a school garden, an organic school garden. This was actually a time where there was an Alar scare, and Meryl Streep actually made her foray into the world of pesticide activism. And so we thought that this was a really good thing to do. So you can see some of our gardens here. They are all organic, obviously. We compost and we use rain barrels to collect water. And of the 5 elementary schools and the junior high and the high school in Port Washington, 5 of them have organic gardens that have been going on for decades now. We found that we had extensive spraying, however, when we first started the garden. And we, if you know about gardening and you work at a school, you spend a lot of time weeding and, helping the kids. And we were there one day, and the school maintenance people or field people were approaching the garden with backpacks filled with pesticides and sprayer wands. And I said, "Where are you going?" And they said, "Well, we're just going to get all the weeds around the fence line here." And I said, "Actually, you're not going anywhere near this garden, and why are we spraying pesticides on school property?" So we were able to go to the school board and to get our district to pass a school board policy prohibiting the use of any pesticides on school grounds. And then we thought, well, that was easy. Maybe we could do that in other places. So we eventually, over a year and a half, were able to get 17 schools in the downstate area to pass school board policies. And then we went to Albany, and we said, well, here we go, and we have letters from superintendents that it is cost-effective and efficacious, and the kids are not being exposed, and why wouldn't we do this? And we basically had an idea that when it came to our children, there were no compromises. So there wasn't going to be a little bit of spraying, for these particular trees or, this particular football field and so on. And that's actually where Chip came into the picture. And we found Chip and understood that, that it wasn't rocket science to produce a beautiful athletic field. I mean, and I'm just giving the brief overview here, Chip, between aerating and overseeding, and just to relieve that compaction because compaction is turf grass's worst enemy. That's right out of Chip's presentation. So that's just relieving of the compaction. Just think of all those little feet on those fields at schools and in parks. So that if you could do that and just overseed throughout the entire season, and then you could complement that, of course, with compost tea applications or organic fertilizers and so on, or soil amendments that are needed, we didn't really have to do the pesticide thing at all. So this actually turned into the only law in the United States that prohibits the use of pesticides at all schools, public, private, parochial, K through 12, including daycare centers. And we have to thank the legislators who did this, Steve Engelbright, who was in the Assembly. I can't even remember who our senator sponsor was on this. I can't believe it was in 2010. But we actually did it, and you can see all the other groups underneath that poster that we made, thank you New York, that were involved. And so it's really, really important to have partners in this process, especially when you're dealing with politicians. Really important to show them that there are a lot of groups, and those groups have their constituents, and so they're much more impressed when you have other groups working with you and individuals. Okay, so that was that one. So, then we continued on pesticides because we were using pesticides still in our communities, of course, and you could see the landscaper trucks up and down the streets, and so we started doing pesticide education in the schools, and you probably can't read that very well, but the kids, and literally thousands of kids, made these safe lawn flags and did their own original drawings. There's one at the top with a dog that says, "Do you really want this to happen to your dog?" which is a dead dog. And then the lower right, it's a little ladybug, and it says, "Come in, good bugs." So it's really kind of wonderful to work with kids and build that early awareness. Okay, so we also did a lot of informing the public. We had the Spring Alert Flyer, which is the third one over from the left. We put this out every single year in every single teacher's box in many, many different school districts in the downstate area, just warning parents to make their children aware of these pesticide application flags. We have a nice quote in there from Dr. Landrigan, and we have used this very successfully for years and years and years, because if there is one demographic that really cares and will actually not sign a contract for a pesticide program, it's parents of young children. Okay, so next thing is we did a lot of partnering with professionals. We actually went to visit the NYSTLA, the New York State Turf and Landscape Association, the Nassau-Suffolk Landscape Association, and convinced them to allow us to give training sessions to their members, who were all deeply involved with and convinced that pesticide applications were the only way to maintain lawns. And so we brought in Chip Osborne. You can see him there, a little younger Chip. Just a little younger Chip. Just a little. Just a little. And also a wonderful guy that we met, James Sotillo. He's an arborist. And we first met him when we were training him on Long Island. And this was a guy who, as a young man, had worked for an arborist. And in the summer, he was like 17, 18 years old. And in the summertime, he said, I would just get underneath a tulip tree with the hose and just direct it straight up and just get cooled off by all that pesticide, dripping down on me. Well, he wound up with cancer of his sinuses and facial bones. And so he was a convert. He now heads up a business that is an arbor company, and a tree company, and they utilize compost tea sprays as well as other natural things. Also at that, one of those first trainings, we met a young man who said that he was the Dursban man. This is a chlorpyrifos. That's the trade name for chlorpyrifos. And he came in with braces on both of his legs, and he had suffered from peripheral neuropathy from that spraying, which is very common from that exposure to Dursban. Okay, so we also wanted to say that we worked with Westchester County very strongly. They provided county parks and facilities for us to do these trainings for free. We wound up with more organic landscapers in Westchester County than in any other county in the United States. It was a very popular thing to do. We also worked with NOFA, the Northeast Organic Farming Association. And these are really, really important things, and that is to get together and partner with people, because everybody plays a role here and everybody has something important to share with this. Organic pest management policy. So I was appointed an ecological commissioner for our town of North Hempstead, and they had an IPM policy. And as you just heard from Chip, IPM is something that the industry is very supportive of. It's originally was called Integrated Pesticide Management. And so you have to be a little bit wary, because if the industry loves it, there's got to be something wrong with it. So I felt that it was only as good as the person administering it, because you have to use the least toxic first, but then you can go and use any other pesticide that's available. There are no restrictions. Is that right, Chip?
Then you can move right up the chain.
You can move right up the chain and use any pesticide that's available. So we changed that from an IPM policy for the town of North Hempstead, which incorporates 17 towns, by the way, on Long Island. It's a larger municipal government. And so we had, I think, the second organic pest management policy in the country. There was another one in Southern California. And other places have used this to just use as a draft for something that they might make or a template that they might do. I know that Marblehead, Massachusetts used this template for their organic pest management policy, and it has been, I think, useful for a lot of people. So, partnering with local institutions. Here's the Port Washington Public Library. We got them to do an organic lawn program, and you can see the director of the library there with 2 local landscapers who took our courses and became so convinced that it was the way to go that they converted their entire lawn care business to organics. And, every year, you look at this library lawn and you think, there's not a drop of pesticide on that lawn. It is perfect. It is beautiful. And we always tell people to go look at that. I do write a column in the local paper, and usually in the spring I'll write something called The Real Cost of a Green Lawn. Now, we happen to have a neighbor in our community, the Hagedorn family, which invented Miracle Grow, and they sold Miracle Grow to the Scotts Company, and now they own 80% of the stock in the Scotts Company, that family. And so I would get a call from Horace Hagedorn, who has since passed on, and he would say, "Hi, Patty, this is Horace. I'm just making sure that you're not a syndicated columnist yet. That article hasn't gone any further than just Port Washington." So it's interesting. That has been a very, very interesting thing in Port Washington, because we have a field here which is part of the police youth athletic group, and the Scotts Company donates product to them. So we had a little meeting, and we were able to get the Scotts Company to just donate their organic fertilizer product to the PYA field. But I have to go back a little bit, because chlorpyrifos or Dursban was actually banned for sale to the public back in, now Jay will know this, 2003? Yeah. And so the Scotts Company and other manufacturers of this product had to take it off the shelves, and what they did is they donated it to youth athletic clubs and schools, even though the reason we were taking it off the shelves is because it was such a serious neurotoxin and a risk to young children. So we've had our battles with the Scotts Company. Let's see. So I'm not covering everything here, but this is Parks for Kids New York City, although we call it something different now. And I just wanted to say, and this is from Paula, who handed this to me, we have a sign-up for New Yorkers for pesticide-free parks. And if you want, I'm going to put it on this front table right behind Chip. And if you would like to sign up to participate in this push for the bill that Legislator Kallos or Councilman Kallos has talked about, that would be great. Now let's talk a little bit about the New York City Park. So New York State passed that law to ban pesticides at all schools, but that did not help New York City kids, because New York City kids don't have their own football fields and their own playgrounds and so on. They play on city parks. So it's time really for us to do this. It's actually past time for us to be doing this. We are trying very hard to pass a bill. As you heard from the councilman, the parks are going to fight this because they like that. They like that product. And that product is a carcinogen. I mean, we have studies from the 1960s and 70s that show a link between the use of glyphosate and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in humans and canine lymphoma in dogs. So this has been around for a long time, this association between this particular pesticide. So we really need to try very hard, all of us in this room and anybody else that you know that has an association or is part of a group of parents, especially in this city. The stroller brigade is, when we were talking earlier to the councilman, he said the stroller brigade on the 18th at City Hall would be very impressive. So if you know parents of young children, it's time to do that. And we're still working out some of the details. There's always compromises. I know that Joel he has been fighting the good fight for so many years in this city, and for all the right reasons. And so we're trying to incorporate some of the things in there so that, you know, we have some recourse when the city doesn't do the right thing on, you know, for our kids. So I'll just end with that, and thank you very much. Before Chip speaks again, I just want to say that all of the work that we do is based on independent science. This is all peer-reviewed academic research. And we do have this digest of the independent science on turf pesticides and children's health that we use in Connecticut. We also have a law in Connecticut. It doesn't go as far as New York's law, but we do have another law in Connecticut. And we use this to convince the legislators there that this was really worth doing. So you can come and look at this, and we actually have the index for this on our table out there.
Thank you, Patti. We're going to hear once again from Peter del Tredici. Peter is an esteemed botanist, is a former senior research scientist at Arnold Arboretum for 35 years, and a lecturer at Harvard Graduate School of Design. Dr. del Tredici is the author of the widely acclaimed Urban Plants of the Northeast, a field guide, which is available outside in the lobby. So with that, Peter,
Thank
welcome.
you very much.
Thank you.
Well, it is a pleasure to be back here again, and this is such a great venue. I took advantage during one of the breaks to take a little walk outside in Central Park. I always love, coming to New York to see Central Park, and I remember a couple of years ago I was here. It was just the same time of year, early spring, and I told my wife, let's walk across the park. We don't need to take a cab. And I thought, well, maybe I'll see some spontaneous vegetation, and that would be interesting. And we walked all the way across the park, and I'll say, I didn't see a single weed in Central Park. And I thought, this is really strange. What's going on here? And I realized, it took me a while to realize that in Central Park they use a special kind of mulch that they don't really use in other places. Basically, you take dollar bills and you run them through a chipper, you shred them up, and then you just spread them till they're about an inch thick all the way across the landscape. And the good news is that's an organic weed control method. But not everyone has the luxury of spending millions and millions of dollars on landscape maintenance. So Central Park is really, really unusual in that regard. And it's not a model for most of the cities in the United States because of the extreme wealth that exists here. And other cities like Boston and San Francisco, it's the same thing. And so what I'm going to really talk about today is sort of ecology, just sort of a way of thinking about ecology in an urban context. So the term ecology, the way it's used in the popular press, it typically means being green, doing all of the things that people have been talking about today: no fertilizers, no pesticides, recycling, etc. But ecology also is a descriptive science that talks about the interrelationships between the organisms that inhabit that piece of ground. And so it's really important. So everybody uses the term, but it has these very distinctive meanings. So that's really what I'm going to talk about, is what constitutes nature in an urban context. And then how could this translate into action? How can you think about engaging ecological processes in an urban context? But before I get there, I did want to say one thing that I've heard. There's been a lot of talk about lawns and so on and so forth, which is really good. But being an academic, I thought I would introduce a couple of technical terms that I haven't heard here today regarding lawns. And this comes from there's an incredible book called Redesigning the American Lawn by Francis Borman and Diana Balmiri out of Yale University. And they distinguish two different types of lawns. One is the industrial lawn, and I think this is really important, that requires the input of tremendous amounts of petroleum products in the form of pesticides and fertilizers, and the net result is a monoculture of Kentucky bluegrass. And in contradistinction to that, we have the freedom lawn. And of course, everybody wants a freedom lawn, and that's essentially, you view the lawn as a community of organisms, and you let whatever grows in that particular, they're never perfectly smooth, there's always depressions and elevations. You let the plants sort themselves out across this gradient, and then what they have in common is they're all tolerant of mowing. And this is how you, all of a sudden, lawns from being this terrible, thing, all of a sudden become positive from an ecological point of view. Not only can you sit on the surface, you can play on it, but you actually get biodiversity happening in there, and it's a community of plants. So these are the two types. So a lot of people say, oh, you got to dig up your lawn and put in a meadow. No, actually, you just need to change the way you take care of that lawn. And, it's obviously it's organic, but I like this whole idea of calling them a freedom lawn. Because I think all of a sudden, it's all about marketing, and how do you convince people that they need to change the way they do things? And what's hard to imagine is that up until the invention of herbicides, things like dandelions and clover, they were just accepted as part of the lawn because you couldn't get rid of them. And it's only with the widespread use of herbicides in the 1950s that all of a sudden there was massive public relations campaigns on the part of the chemical companies to declare these things weeds, and if you were going to have a perfect lawn, you as a citizen were obliged to get rid of the white clover and the dandelions. It was a cultural shift. Okay, the lawn is a much more healthy, resilient ecosystem if it's diverse. The more diverse it is, the more resilient it is. When you reduce it to a monoculture of just one species, you lose a tremendous amount of its ecological functionality. So with that, my little comment, I'm going to go into my slides. Now, I was just going to sort of, I thought it would be a panel discussion, so I didn't really prepare a talk. But what I thought I would do, because I ended my talk in a rush, a mad rush to stay within the time, I thought I wanted to go over this one last part of my talk that I felt as though I did not really get to devote enough time explaining what was actually happening. So this is this section of the Arnold Arboretum in Boston, 24-acre parcel of land that represents derelict urban land that became part of the Arnold Arboretum in 1996. It's called the Bussy Brook Meadow. And you can see there's a state testing lab. It's part of the University of Massachusetts, but that little path in front transects Bussy Brook Meadow, goes from the Forest Hill subway station to the Arnold Arboretum. And what's really interesting is that in 2011, I was able to convince the director of the garden that we needed to set aside this parcel of land, not to make it look like the rest of the Arnold Arboretum, which is a very carefully curated and maintained Olmsted landscape, but to leave it alone so that we could study the processes of urban ecology. What happens when you just leave things alone? People do not do that in cities, particularly cities like New York and Boston, where the land is tremendously valuable. It may sit vacant for 5, maybe even 10 years, but sooner or later, somebody's going to come along and rip it all up and put something in there. And so we have very little data on the trajectory of these spontaneous urban landscapes over time. And so there's a real need for saying, okay, we're going to monitor ecological functions in this area over time and see what actually happens. And this particular area, one of the first roads in Boston, South Street, leading out of Boston, going to Dedham, was built about 300 years ago. So this is an area, went right along Bussy Brook Meadow, that was used for agricultural purposes. And then over time, because it was a wetland, all this infrastructure was essentially imposed on the site because that was vacant land. And so it has what I like to call 300 years of abuse. So it's a very good sort of model for what I would consider some typical neglected urban landscapes. And I showed this picture yesterday, but an 8-foot diameter sewer pipe that carries raw sewage from the Jamaica Plain section of Boston down to a sewage waste treatment plant on the South Shore. They just put that in there in 1900 and then covered it over. And by the time I started working there in the 1980s, we'd forgotten this pipe even existed, until there was a massive storm and the whole pipe surcharged with stormwater, and then it blew in a neighborhood down the street from the Arboretum. It didn't blow in the Arboretum because we'd put so much fill on top of it that the emergency relief valve didn't blow in the Arboretum, and it was supposed to go into the meadow, but it never did. So, there are lots of things that happen in cities that are, somewhat mysterious, and until you really understand how the systems work, you don't understand it. A landfill was put illegally on the site between 1955 and 1965. There was an esker there. Somebody dug that whole hill up for its sand and gravel, used that for construction purposes, and then put the remains of 3 public schools in a landfill, and then consequently went bankrupt, leaving that as a legacy of this past land use. And then, of course, a train line, because it was a wetland. The trains always went along the edges of these wetlands, and that had a major impact on one whole side of it. But the thing that's really interesting is you can see here in this picture, and in the foreground you have a plant called reed canary grass, then you have another plant, the yellow flag iris, and then in the background you have Phragmites. This is one section of the wetland. What's really interesting is these plants have spontaneously, without anybody doing anything, organized themselves into a functional wetland across a moisture gradient. This happens, the plants do this on their own. None of them are native to North America. Okay, this is a degraded wetland in which, raw sewage, from surcharged stormwater drains have poured. Okay, this is not a pristine wetland. This is an urban wetland. So those plants really perform an incredible function in terms of being able to deal with the reality of the site conditions as they exist. So this is essentially the way that the site existed when I sort of became involved in it. And what's really interesting is that because it's adjacent to the Arnold Arboretum, a lot of the plants from the Arnold Arboretum, with the help of birds, have spread into Bussey Brook Meadow. So it's like this Arnold Arboretum gone wild. What would happen if you stopped maintaining it? And so, those are big ailanthus trees on the right-hand side there. I call that the ailanthus allée, of course, to give it a fancy design term. And we opened up the area and maintained the path, keep really good sight lines here, and people actually love this area because it is urban nature. And so, yes, everybody loves the Arnold Arboretum, but this is a different kind of nature. This is nature that is not totally, it's a little bit out of control. And, there are 2 kinds of people in the world. There are, the neat freaks, who look at a site like this and say, when are you going to clean it up, And then there are the nature lovers who look at this and say, oh, this is real nature. And this is an opportunity for people to actually, in the city, to get a feeling for nature. And it's really important that we begin to learn, how do you look at these types of sites? How do you begin to think of them? And particularly for cities that don't have the economic resources available to turn everything into a manicured park, strategies for how you work with sites like this become very significant. And I just think in the New York area, I think of something like Van Cortlandt Park, which is a huge area. And you're never going to get rid of all the invasive species in Van Cortlandt Park. And what would be the point anyway? It needs to be managed as a urban wild area. And what's interesting about it is the landscape is a little wild, but what's also interesting is that the way people use a site like this is also a little bit out of control. So, you have people drinking beer at 8 in the morning. You have all sorts of illicit activity happening on a site like this because it's a little bit wild. And I would assert that that is actually okay, because these activities are going to happen somewhere. And, if they happen here, well, so be it. So it's part and parcel. Once you have accepted this type of landscape, you were going to go with an urban wild as a form, then you also have to accept the fact that people are going to use this type of landscape in ways that you may not be totally approving of. And I showed this slide here, which was this process when you begin to work with these spontaneous landscapes that have tremendous amount of ecological value in terms of the functions they produce in these types of situations. And what I like to say is that up until 2008, when I would talk about this stuff, nobody paid much attention. They thought I was making a joke or something, actually, or you can't be serious. But with the economic downturn in 2008, what happened is that people realized that actually what I was suggesting was very cost effective. That in fact, learning how to manipulate these areas as opposed to turning them into parks or trying to get rid of all the invasive species, that actually working with the situation as it exists. This is called conciliation ecology. It's not about wiping anything out. It's about working with nature as it exists, is another approach that not only is more ecological, but it's also more economically viable. So it's this process of design by removal. And it's called, they call this in the sense of intaglio, from engraving, where you remove the material you don't want to create a positive image. And I showed this slide last time, and basically it's using a weed whacker. When this idea was originally proposed, it was using herbicides. It was using 2,4-D to get rid of trees underneath power lines so that you could create a stable shrubland underneath the power lines that would require less maintenance. That book, that was rejected in the 1960s by the environmentalists. Oh my God, using herbicides, conservationists, people didn't want to have anything to do with it. And it's one of the great ironies of the world in which we live that now the conservation people who want to use herbicides to control invasive species have now become some of the biggest proponents of the use of herbicides to control the spread of invasive species. And I would assert that you can use a weed whacker and a handsaw just as effectively as you could have used herbicides. Now, this question about deletion, so I'm not saying you have to accept spontaneous vegetation lock, stock, and barrel. No. There's some things you want to remove. High-climbing vines. Vines are a parasitic life form that make their living essentially by strangling trees. That's what they want to do. They want to tear those trees down. So if you want trees, you pretty much have to control the vines. Diseased, seriously damaged, hazard trees, any tree that represents a hazard to people who might be walking along the path, you have to get rid of that. And plants that are unfriendly or unhealthy, like poison ivy, ragweed, which is allergenic, multiflora rose, or Japanese barberries, you should probably also take those under control, particularly poison ivy. And again, this idea that, native species are all good. Poison ivy and ragweed, of course, are native species. And of course, unsightly and aggressive plants. And this is a really important part, that the people who live in low-income neighborhoods where a lot of this vegetation is sort of grows spontaneously in vacant lots, they don't like these plants because they're perceived as indicators of dereliction and neglect. So in those neighborhoods, you have to actually respect the feelings of the people who live in those neighborhoods. No, they do not want mugwort in their neighborhood. They don't want ailanthus growing there. They want to see a maintained park. So this is not a strategy that works across the board. So you have to actually select those areas in which this approach is appropriate. And conversely, I also believe that in certain situations where you have spontaneous vegetation, you can enhance it through insertions, or what I would call sustainable insertions. So what makes a sustainable plant? It needs to be tolerant of the prevailing site conditions without a lot of site modification, require minimal applications of pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers in order to look good. So, no hybrid tea roses. Able to flourish without supplemental water. This is critically important. They need to be drought tolerant, and they need to be non-invasive. So I'm not advocating planting Japanese knotweed. I'm not advocating planting ailanthus. I think you need to be careful about that. I'm just saying where they exist, it's okay to accept them as part of the ecology, the urban ecology. And, landscapes that are designed with plants that fit the criteria, both native and introduced species, not only be less costly to maintain, but also better able to tolerate unpredictable weather that looms in the future. That's what resilience is. We don't know what's going to happen, so we need plants that can deal with unpredictability. And my last slide here, and I thought hard about whether I should put this in or not because it usually causes a lot of consternation among the audience. But, you know, we tend to think about, you know, we have, you know, design and we have ecology. We have horticulture and we have ecology. And the thing about gardening and design that people find attractive is that in a garden, you get to play God. Okay, you decide who lives and who dies. All right, I like this plant, I don't like this plant. I'm going to get rid of this plant, and this is the one I want. So that's it's an illusion, of course, but you know, that's what, you know, is so appealing about this process of gardening. But, you know, so this is what I show my students, but in fact, there's some very interesting dichotomies. One of my students said, well, this is like the difference between the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. You know, planned versus spontaneous. You can see where I'm going. Cultivated versus wild. Neat versus messy. This is the thing about ecology, is it's really messy. And that's what promotes biodiversity. That's what wildlife likes. If you want animals, you need to have a messy landscape. They are looking for cover, okay? They don't like everything neat and tidy. Rigid versus adaptive. Stasis versus flux, okay? It's this idea of, you know, static. You know, we want the landscape to look a certain way, and we're going to maintain it to keep that way. And of course, I make a distinction between maintenance and management. Maintenance is to maintain the status quo, and management is to let change happen. This is a really important distinction when you start thinking about these landscapes, and of course, ultimately, creation versus evolution. That's the one that people really get annoyed at me with. But the fact of the matter is, you know, that is what it's all about. And so sort of my last few things, ecology is about the absence of design, because ecology is about letting nature take control of the process. We've been talking about systems, and so the system is the plants and the animals working it out together. You know, usually when people try to intervene in that system, we end up screwing it up. Maintenance is about arresting ecological succession in order to preserve design. And finally, sustainability is about reducing maintenance in order to promote ecology. So I know this is a little bit controversial, and I did it just to get everybody riled up. But thank you for your attention.